By the 1920s, cars were becoming easier to buy. There was a growing second-hand market, boosting the number of people who were able to afford them.
Eventually, a great day arrived when I got enough money to be able to buy a motor car for myself. And I went up to Northamptonshire by train and I bought this car, and never having driven a car in my life before, I got into it and drove from Northamptonshire to London, right through London, and I'd never had a lesson of any sort of driving other than reading books. Of course, there weren't many cars on the road. It makes a lot of difference. You couldn't do that now. There were no driving tests, of course. In fact, I'm one of the few people left, I suppose, who've never taken a driving test.
That was my first occasion when I did something I've never done since in all my years of motoring. I knocked a man down. And I stopped the car to find this man clinging to the radiator, yelling his head off. I stopped and went round to him, and he went for me bald-headed. But he wasn't hurt. But I knocked him down, but he wasn't hurt. That was in motoring in those days. Because you didn't go very fast, of course. That was my first experience at the age of 15, driving a car at 15, knocking a man down. Good start, you might say, to a long motoring life.
The face of England is rapidly undergoing a change. The method of living has already changed. The old days, so redolent of leisurely peace, are slipping into the past. The large towns are spreading their tentacles further into the country and engulfing quiet little villages. The motor car is undoubtedly the primary cause of this transformation.
And even in those quiet and traffic-free villages, motoring began to leave its mark. Tarmac replaced the gravel, dust and potholes. The local blacksmith started selling petrol, mending punctures and learning to be a mechanic.
The enthusiast in those days, the machine was his idol, and he liked to do everything himself with his own hand. We all did our own servicing. More than servicing, I mean, you think nothing of taking the head off, the block off, fit new pistons.
My father was a keen mechanic. He would rather take a car to pieces than take his family out for a drive.
No motorist ever passed a motorist who had broken down for any reason, even if it was only a puncture. They would always stop in the old days. If you broke down, you always got some help, and we broke down fairly often, of course, in those days. If you passed somebody with the same make of car as yourself, you raised a hand as you passed each other. It seems incredible, doesn't it? But that's what we used to do. But way back in the 1930s, it was just a sport in itself to own one. A joy to own just as a hobby. All of us own cars these days, and we only use them really to go to work or go to the shops and something. In those days, you'd go out and sit in your car and not drive it at all.
The car and the road it ran on were developing at an incredible speed. Fast cars without the mud, potholes and dust. A combination the pioneer road hogs could only dream about.
Of course, they weren't very hog-like, because if you got 20 miles an hour, you were doing very well in the early days. I remember having a car that could do 40 miles an hour, and then when I was a young man, I got one that did 60 miles an hour. Incredible.
They're hitting it up, running flat out, going great guns. Swelling, roaring hymn to the god of speed. Listen to it.
In the 1930s, amateur motorsport blossomed. It was the age of the open sports car and the daredevil driver.
By 1932, MGs had started to appear, which were reasonably inexpensive, so that my friends with a little money could afford cars. I certainly couldn't, being a student. But so we used to go in for trials most weekends.
Shelsley Walsh is an international climb. The hill is 1,000 yards long, with an average gradient steeper than 1 in 9, and a maximum of 1 in 6. What a climb.
Well, the main hill climb was Shelsley Walsh, and this was broadcast on the BBC, and we never used to miss it, because Raymond Mays was there, all the famous were there. The object was to get up the hill as quickly as possible. You had perhaps 2 practice runs, and you had 2 runs against the stopwatch. And it was the stopwatch. There was no electronic timing, and there were a fair number of arguments about it. Trials were quite different. This was down market, really. So when you'd bought your MG and hadn't got the girls you hoped to win, you went in for trials, possibly getting her to be a passenger. And there, the object was to get up very muddy, hills without stopping.
Testing cars to the limit proved the ultimate challenge to the pioneers. As early as 1913, this Talbot car covered the magic 100 miles in less than an hour at the Brooklands racetrack. But it was fraught with danger. Driver Percy Lambert's triumph was short-lived. He was killed later that year, trying to beat his own record.
Brooklands had been built by 1907 so that cars could go really fast. And by 1939, they really were going fast. They were lapping Brooklands, which was incredibly bumpy by that time, at about 140 miles an hour.
By now, there were 2 million cars on the road, their drivers enjoying the benefits of all this progress, all this pioneering, all this motor mania.
You had the open road, and when they took the speed limits off, you could go very quickly indeed, because the speed limits came off, I think, about 1935. Up till then, there'd been a 20 limit. Then we had no speed limits. And then sooner afterwards, they introduced, or at the same time, they introduced the 30 limit in built-up areas. But it meant that one could go very fast indeed, and by that time, vehicles had improved so much, they were improving by leaps and bounds.
I wonder what you'd do if I really let her roll out.
Couldn't we take her down there and try her out on the sand?
Yes, let's.
I am a car you can trust. Together we shall set out on high adventure, find new delights, explore counties and countries. In summer I will bring you to the mountains and the sea and the sun. In winter I will keep out the cold and the rain. I'm your friend, your partner, your companion. I am your car.
Garage with one pump. You can't afford to employ a petrol attendant. Good gracious, no. One of the bods from the garage would go up and serve the petrol, take the money, and wipe his hands, and then go back to his job. Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Now, what is your trouble, lady?
I've told you once, there's something wrong with the engine of my car. It doesn't run as smoothly as it used to.
Oh, we'll soon put that right. Carburetor.
Well, I can't wait now. I'm in a hurry. Can you have it ready by 6?
6? Oh, yes, lady, yes.
You're sure now?
Oh, positive. It won't take more than half an hour.
Very well, I'll call for it then. And I do hope it's ready, because I want to use it this evening.
Yes, well,
I want to use it this evening.
Oh.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, lady.
I mean, they're not all crooks. Take it from me. The car men I know, the garage people, are nice chaps.
Have a look at her engine, will you? Well, I'll have to sift some of this stuff first. Well, get a move on. She wants it at 6 o'clock.
There's always a certain mystique. What happens to my car when it disappears behind that curtain and I'm no longer in control? When it comes back from the curtain, I've got a bill for 200 quid.
In the early 30s, there was such a great variety of motor cars. You had Singers and Galloways and Star, and goodness knows Kleino, and of course Morris and Austin. But the number of makes of cars built in this country, amazing.
Oh, yes? Oh, there you are. Have you done anything on Mrs. Kennedy's car yet?
Not yet. I've got to finish this job first.
Well, leave it and get a jerk on.
Why, Alf, lend us your screwdriver, will you?
I've lost things like that before.
We have actually taken house bricks from inside the chassis, and we've taken straw, and we've taken wire wool. Yes, there is that side of the trade.
Get me a spanner. Right now. I can't find a plug spanner, Alf.
Well, bring a shifter.
When the Ford Motor Company made this dealer training film in 1935, the garage trade was about 30 years old.
Here, you do it.
In the beginning, there were no proper garages at all. Motorists relied on a variety of established trades like ironmongers, cycle shops and blacksmiths.
A blacksmith shed, a haven of refuge, where already were signs of new industries springing to life.
Well, we're a third-generation family business, which goes back to the early 1900s when my grandfather had a second-hand shop in West Bromwich, in Spon Lane. He then moved on to bicycles, and then after bicycles, he got an agency for motorbikes, which were becoming popular. He was a very big man who weighed about 17 stone apparently, and one of the things he could do for his customers was that if you bought one of the sit-up-and-beg early motorcycles from him and it wasn't comfortable, he would stand in front of the bike and he would actually bend the handlebars until it fitted the purchaser, for which he was quite famous.
Garages began to crop up and be established purely as motor car repair establishments around about 1905-1906. We came here in June 1912 with the intention of setting up a hire car business, because you see there were a great many gentry people in the town who didn't own a motor car, and there was an old chap here who was a solicitor who hired a car and a driver for a week at Goodwood races, and that I tell you, there was great competition for that job. But that's the sort of thing that happened in the very early days, particularly before the 14-18 war. When cars became easier to drive, they simplified the driving. They were much more comfortable to drive. They were lighter on the steering and the controls and so on. So people bought their own motor cars and learned to drive them. And so the hire business tailed off. So you developed into maintaining, what they call servicing nowadays, maintaining and repairing and keeping motor cars on the road for customers.
All cars needed fuel, so garages and repair shops all sold petrol.
Petrol, by the way, is a registered name. Carlos Capel and Leonard, a chemical firm, they distilled petroleum fluid and called it petrol, and they registered the name, and it is still their monopoly. So we mustn't talk about petrol, we must talk about motor spirit.
Well, whatever it was called, it came in barrels, in tins packed in crates, or in 2-gallon cans. At first, motor spirit was carried from refinery to town and city by the oil company's own railway tankers. These oil companies were to become big players in the motoring story. Horse-drawn or motor-driven lorries delivered to garages whose owners had the foresight to invest in underground tanks and the new hand-cranked pumps.
About 1920-21, the curbside petrol pump became popular. Well, we had a Shell pump on the pavement about 1921. It was actually the third curbside petrol pump in the town.
Out in the country, motorists relied on fuel from repair shops, pubs, or even enterprising farmers. But this was the future. Britain's first purpose-built filling station, opened by the AA at Aldermaston, Berkshire in 1920. Many motorists actually went out of their way to fill up at this modern site.
Filling stations began to develop in the middle to late 20s, when entrepreneurs would establish a filling station with 2, 3, 4 pumps of different brands on the main roads.
Traditional village life had already been disrupted by the car, so when entrepreneurs built cheap tin sheds out of corrugated iron adorned with garish enamel signs, it was just too much. May 28, 1927. Dear Sir, our special beauty spots are already much marred and our villages will be completely spoilt if something is not done to prevent these hideous erections. Gordon Griffiths, County Surveyor, Herefordshire. In 1928, after a vigorous campaign by the Council for the Protection of Rural England, Parliament gave local councils control over garages. Down came the enamel signs.